Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
You're tuned in to Cineversary, a podcast that celebrates a milestone anniversary of a masterful work of cinema. Each month we send happy birthday wishes to a different film currently observing a joyous jubilee, everything from a 20th to a 100th anniversary. I'm your host, Eric Martin, creator and moderator of the Cineverse Film Discussion Group that now meets weekly on Zoom. Fake news has captured a lot of attention in the last few years, but believe it or not, fake news has been around for hundreds of years. At least that's what we're led to believe after watching one of the finest cinematic works ever created, Rashomon, directed by Akira Kurosawa, which marks a 70th birthday this month. So if you're a fan of Kurosawa, you know that most of his movies are part of the Criterion Collection. And the prominent voice of expertise about all things Kurosawa, who commonly provides the audio commentaries and essays for those Kurosawa titles by Criterion, is none other than Stephen Prince, professor of film history, criticism, and theory at Virginia Tech. Stephen is second to none in his diligent research about and knowledge of this director and his films, and I'm proud to say, yep, we've got him for this go-round of Cineversary. But before we bring Stephen up to the microphone, let's take a moment and gather some background on our spotlight feature for August, according to Wikipedia. Rashomon is a 1950 psychological thriller crime film directed by Akira Kurosawa, working in close collaboration with cinematographer Kazuo Miyagawa. It stars Toshiro Mifune, Mashiko Kyo, Masayuki Mori, and Takashi Shimura. The film depicts the rape of a woman and the murder of her samurai husband through the widely differing accounts of 4 witnesses, including the bandit rapist, the wife, the dead man speaking through a medium, and lastly the woodcutter, the one witness who seems the most objective and least biased. The stories are mutually contradictory, and the plot of the story and characters are based upon Akutagawa Ryanosuke's short story In a Grove, with the title and framing story being based on Rashomon, another short story by Akutagawa. The tale takes place in the 11th century at Rashomon, an important gate outside a prominent city. The film is known for a plot device that involves various characters providing subjective, alternative, self-serving, and contradictory versions of the same incident. In fact, the term the Rashomon effect, still used in courtrooms today, is named after this film. The movie was originally released on August 26, 1950 in Japan. Rashomon was the first Japanese film to receive a significant international reception. It won several awards, including the Golden Lion at the Venice Film Festival in 1951 and an Academy Honorary Award at the 24th Academy Awards in 1952. And it's considered one of the greatest films ever made. The film scores an impressive 98%, for example, on Rotten Tomatoes, where its average critical score is 9.22 out of 10. Okay, let's give a portion of the original trailer a spin, shall we? But bear in mind that the voiceover is in Japanese, although it's still worth a listen to hear snatches of the score and snippets of dialogue from the film, which kind of helps you get in the proper Rashomon mood.
私は世にも恐ろしい地獄を見た。盗賊、美女、死霊、そしてソマウリ、4つの口が物語る4つの地獄の声を聞かされた。まさにこれは心のジャングルの藪の中の物語。ギラギラと光る重欲の目が。
集落外にそのまま知られたこの太政丸が帰って手をついてたの。今日が俺の妻になると言ってくれ。俺の妻になると言ってくれ。
私は今闇の中にいる。一筋の光もない闇の中で苦しみもらえている。この無限の闇に私を突き落とした者に呪いあれ。
So it's that time of the show to issue a fair warning. Beware, fellow travelers, the road ahead is paved with spoilers aplenty. So if you haven't yet screened Rashomon, what are you doing with your life? Ready? Let's give a warm welcome to Virginia Tech film professor and Kurosawa connoisseur, Stephen Prince. Stephen, thanks for joining our program.
It's my pleasure, Eric.
I've enjoyed your work on the Criterion Collection for so many years. It really adds a lot of thrill and joy to be able to hear your commentaries and read your essays. And you were the absolute first person I thought of when I knew I was going to honor Rashomon and its 70th anniversary. So thanks again for saying yes.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I enjoy talking about Kurosawa and certainly talking about Rashomon.
So I want to ask you first when and where you saw this movie initially and why Rashomon is important to you.
Well, I believe that the first time I saw this film was during my years as an undergraduate in college. I did my undergraduate work at the University of Maryland, and I took a Intro to Cinema course. Of course, back then it was called Introduction to Film, because things were on film. And that film was screened in the context of the course. And at the time, I had not seen other Kurosawa movies, so I didn't have a very extensive context for the movie. But one thing that always impressed me about Kurosawa's work, and that includes this film, was his use of the moving camera.
Right.
That use of the moving camera was unlike anybody else had done it. And that drew me to his work. It was so exciting and so sensual and stimulating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I've tried to pay more attention to that. By virtue of the essay you wrote for the Criterion Collection edition of Rashomon, you talked a little bit about that moving camera and especially the shots through the forest where you had not only had the camera moving, but the subject moving and the kind of leaves and foliage moving to create this kind of kinetic effect, this sensual kind of feel in the forest, as you wrote.
Yeah, this immersion into the forest was really kind of unique in a sense. It was not all that common for movies to have such extensive camera movement at that time. Of course, there were exceptions. Max O'Fools, for example, was noted for long labyrinthine camera movements. But in this case, in that sequence in Rashomon, where we're introduced to the woodcutter as he's walking through the forest, all of those camera movements and the montage of shots that Kurosawa builds out of it are not there to tell the story. They're not really advancing the story. It's working on a different level entirely. And so that was very exciting. It's camera movement in a kind of poetic and metaphorical way to talk to us on different levels beyond those of story.
Well said. Yeah, I can't wait to dig into this a little bit further as we pursue some more questions here. But for my part, my initial watch of Rashomon was probably around 20 years ago on DVD. I don't know if Criterion had the rights at the time, but probably was their edition. But it immediately became my favorite work of foreign cinema. And that is, of course, until I caught Kurosawa's Seven Samurai shortly thereafter, in which it was kind of a toss-up between which one did I like better. But yeah, it's continued to hold a very high place in my own pantheon.
I can distinctly remember when the first time I saw Rashomon, which was in this film class. I can remember the first time I saw Seven Samurai. I can remember the first time I saw Throne of Blood, the first time I saw Yojimbo.
That says something, right? It's embedded in your memory.
Yeah.
That probably speaks to the power of the direction and the filmmaking, I assume, right? Would you agree?
I think it does, and it speaks to the singularity of those experiences, meeting those films for the first time.
Right.
Yes.
And I mean, you've probably seen Rashomon dozens of times since. You probably teach it in film course and so forth, but it's that first time especially that is emblazoned in your recollection, I imagine.
Yes, and one, of course, has to do Rashomon if one is teaching Kurosawa, as I've done, and as I'll be doing again in just a few weeks.
Fantastic.
When the school semester begins.
So why is Rashomon worth celebrating 70 years later, Stephen? How has it stood the test of time, and why does it still matter?
Well, there are a lot of reasons why this movie has stood the test of time. Of course, one thing about cinema is that you never really know until 20, 30, 40 years later which films are going to stand that test of time, which ones will survive. And I think there are a lot of reasons why Rashomon still commands our attention. For one thing, it's one of the very few movies that bequeathed a term to the language.
The Rashomon effect.
We might talk about the Rashomon effect.
Yes.
And lawyers or judges will use that term to talk about cases where the witnesses cannot agree on what it is they saw or experienced.
Mm-hmm.
It's also important as a document of a certain period of filmmaking in Japan. We can talk about that a little bit later, and I've got something very specific in mind about that. It's an important film because of what it did for Kurosawa's career. It made him internationally known and opened a lot of doors for him. He was a superstar director already in Japan at that time, and he had a group of actors and technicians that were associated with him, and that people knew, and they knew of his stature. Teruyo Nagami, who was his longtime executive production assistant and has written a book about working with him, talks about the first time that he came to the studio and how commanding a figure he was, in part because of his height. So he was already known in Japan when he did Rashomon, but the film had such an unexpected success overseas at the Venice Film Festival that he was now not just a nationally known director, but a global figure, an internationally known director, really the first for Japan since World War II.
Is this the film that kind of put Japan on the cinematic map?
Well, in the eyes of the Western world, it is. Of course, Japan, in the eyes of Japanese audiences, the cinema had always been on the map, and,
Sure.
and there had been a terrific period of filmmaking during the silent era and during the 1930s. And into the 40s before the war. And then, after the war, Kurosawa kind of led the reawakening of Japanese cinema.
I see.
It's notable for all of these reasons, in terms of its connection to the history of the period when Kurosawa made it, the way that it defined him on the international stage as a filmmaker. And then I think for us today, this is a film that is very relevant because it shows again one of the really damning truths of human existence, which is that people cannot agree on the basic nature of reality. I mean, look around us now. We're in the midst of this pandemic, which substantial numbers of our fellow citizens deny exists.
You're absolutely right. It's relevant because it raises these deep philosophical questions, right?
Yes, about the nature of social reality and how we recognize it and how we can come to terms with agreeing on its fundamental nature. Here's a film that probes deeply at that, and that's a timeless issue, and it's one that is bedeviling us right now.
Wow, that's a real good food for thought here. I would go even a step further. My own opinion is that I think this is debatably the most philosophical film ever made, at least that I've seen. I mean, it poses serious moral, ethical, psychological, and even spiritual questions. And not only is it a gripping story supported by virtually flawless filmmaking, but this picture challenges you to ponder philosophically difficult questions and existential ramifications, as you've already kind of laid out. And we're continuing to ask those questions today. I want to point to something that you wrote about in your essay, the nonlinear narrative. It creates a complex story that forces you to pay attention and think, not just sit back and be a passive viewer.
That's right. And Kurosawa, he wanted audiences to do that at his movies. He had to reach them in a form that was entertaining, and he was a master at that. But then he would use that to kind of probe below the surface and provoke his audiences with ethically, morally challenging situations that he wanted them to think about.
I love how he doesn't let us see or hear the judge or judges or whoever's presiding over this trial. Instead, the witnesses each face the camera and they speak directly to the viewer as if like we are the magistrates of this moral dilemma.
Yes, that's something that lots of people have commented on, the way that he frames those scenes. And indeed, one can read it in a number of ways. Interestingly, Kurosawa, one of the ways he sold the studio on making this movie, which they were a little reluctant to do because they didn't understand the script.
That's what I read.
They kept asking him, well, what is this all about?
Right.
One of the ways he sold them on making the film is that it wouldn't cost much money. He said, you're only going to need two sets. One is the Rashomon gate, and the other is a wall that I'll shoot the trial against. So I think already in that way of selling the concept to the studio, he's already visualizing how he's going to film it.
Right. So that there's a practical reason, but there's also a reason that benefits the story.
and the ability to get the production made.
Good point. I also think that, I think you touched on this in your essay, but Rashomon plays like a silent movie often. There's very few words spoken for many stretches. There's a lot of expressive unspoken gestures and actions and reactions. And I think the filmmakers aren't aiming for realism here, but rather the honesty of emotion that, is prevalent in silent films that we might have seen.
Yes, Kurosawa talks about this, about wanting to evoke some of the aesthetic of the silent era. He loved many, many silent films, and he felt that there had been a loss of a certain visual poetry that silent movies were very able to do quite well. One of the things that happens to cinema when sound comes in is that it pushes the medium toward naturalism. It moved it away from some of the poetry that became very common throughout the silent period.
Right.
And adding sound to the image attached it more firmly to the ground. And so I think Kurosawa wanted to recover some of that lost poetry from the silent era. And some of the ways that he does it is through the sustained, intensively visual design of the sequences, like that the woodcutters walk through the forest, is a purely visual stream of images that flow like a river. They're unbroken and they're fluid and they're connected. And I think that it impressed audiences at the Venice Festival because it was unusually unrelenting in its visual qualities.
Okay.
And I think that this is a film that's pretty far from naturalism. There's a patina of historical realism in the movie, right? The evocation of the ruined gate and the rain and all of the mud. But at the same time, there are many elements of the style where Kurosawa goes off in a much more poetic direction. For example, the animalistic qualities of Toshiro Mifune's performance.
Right.
And the fact that he and Machiko Kiyo often go well over the top in their performing style. There are moments in the film where he's not really restraining them at all. And that's an uncommonly emphatic acting style to find in sound movies.
And then you have the medium, who we hear at one point, the voice of the dead husband is speaking through her. And you think, well, is this a supernatural movie? I mean, they probably took mediums very seriously back then in the 11th century in Japan, perhaps. But are we as viewers supposed to believe that that's actually the dead man's voice speaking through the medium? Maybe that's kind of a poetic license too, no?
Could be. I always assume it is the voice of the husband speaking through the medium, except that, of course, we're always inside various people's flashbacks.
That's true.
And the flashbacks overlap in that we see some events more than once, but typically those presentations are reflective of the subjective, egocentric point of view of the narrator whose flashback we're in.
Yeah.
Rashomon, of course, was not the first film to do this, right? You can go back to Citizen Kane.
That's right.
And see that kind of a structure.
Yeah, the unreliable narrator, the kind of nonlinear storytelling via conflicting flashbacks and multiple points of view.
Yes.
Stephen, in what ways do you think this film set trends or was influential on cinema or popular culture? We just talked, for example, about the reliance on nonlinear storytelling via those conflicting flashbacks. You did say that there were predecessors, like, for example, Citizen Kane, that use contradictory flashbacks that disagree with the action and maybe suggest unreliable narrators who you're not sure to believe or not. But this still would have been pretty influential stuff in terms of really making a whole movie about that concept, right?
Yes. In terms of popular cinema, this movie could be experienced as a kind of detective story where collectively it sort of invites you to solve the Rashomon murder mystery, which character is telling the truth. And there have been a lot of critics who have written long essays to find out which of the characters is the most reliable. My own sense is that that's ultimately not how the film is working.
And isn't that what Kurosawa kind of said? That's not really the point.
Yeah, he talks about it as a movie in which characters go astray in the thickets of their heart. And the shadows in the forest are meant to evoke this dark heart of humankind, where characters are going astray. So in that sense, it's a kind of pessimistic film.
Sure.
And really, I think for Kurosawa, this is probably the first film in which he gets really close to the edge of the abyss. He's sort of flirted around it in Drunken Angel and Stray Dog, movies that that came prior to this one. But here he gets very close to it. And it's the woodcutter's gesture of adopting the baby at the end that allows us to go out of the movie on a grace note and retain a certain faith in humankind.
I would say the ending, right? I mean, that would have been very uncommon for this period in film history because we're shown 4 testimonies that dispute each other and a conclusion in which there is no clear resolution about what truly happened. So, I mean, you tell me if I'm wrong, but moviegoers at this time were likely used to more definitive denouements in which their mystery gets solved, in which the crimes are punished and justice is served. And like you said, before the woodcutter offers to take the abandoned baby, this was in fact a decidedly pessimistic, perplexing, and disturbing film due to its ambiguity and ethical quandaries.
Yes, and for that reason, it was not a typical entertainment movie.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why the studio executives at Dai, for whom Kurosawa made the movie, didn't like it.
Mm.
In fact, they didn't want to send this movie overseas because they had such an active dislike for it. And they didn't understand that. They felt like it was perverse because it's not following a lot of the formulas of popular movies at the time. And you've just kind of outlined what some of those are.
Was there originally an ending that didn't have the woodcutter taking the baby that maybe the distributors saw, or was it always this ending?
No, there wasn't. This was not a studio imposed ending on the film.
Okay.
Dai had asked Kurosawa to make another movie.
Mm-hmm.
He had kind of finished up the work that he was contracted to do for them. And they'd asked him to do another movie. And so he had this idea in mind to make something from the stories of Akutagawa, the literary author.
Mm-hmm.
And he had seen a short script by Shinobu Hashimoto, who had been working as a screenwriter. And this was Hashimoto's, basically his first script. But it was a very short one. It would only have made about a 40-minute movie. So Kurosawa got the idea to add another Akutagawa story to the mix, which involved the characters sitting around the ruined gate.
Ah, I see. Mm-hmm. He
cobbled together these 2 stories, and Hashimoto claims that it was his idea. Kurosawa claims it was his idea. In any event, the movie is a merging of elements from those 2 stories, and it still runs under 90 minutes. It's still not quite a full 90 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
You can view this really as a kind of experimental movie because it is so different and so unusual in the way that it proceeds and the way that it just embraces ambiguity and really refuses to kind of close down on a single truth about the murder and the attack that's occurred in the forest.
And that's what's brilliant to me is that all the flashbacks are both true and false at the same time. True because each testimony is portrayed as accurate by that particular witness, and false because they contradict each other and reflect a point of view that could be or that definitively is wrong.
That's right. And I think we also have to acknowledge that there's possibly another set of factors that are operating here in terms of working on Kurosawa as an influence in fashioning this story. If you're making a movie in Japan about a crime and a murder and questions of guilt and soliciting the testimony from those who were involved and finding out that at least some of them are telling lies, then you are immediately working in terms of very close historical circumstances. And what I have in mind are the war crimes trials. There were hundreds of trials held by the Allied powers throughout South Asia. And then in Tokyo, from 1946 to 1948, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East tried 28 high-ranking government and political officials, the so-called Class A war criminals. Japan was riveted by this trial. People followed it very closely, and the newspapers covered it quite extensively. So I think that's one of the immediate kind of topical influences on Rashomon. There's nothing in the movie that really references the war itself.
Right.
But I think the immediate cultural, social background to the movie comes out of this experience.
I read, Stephen, that it's been suggested that Kurosawa attempted to illustrate the despair and confusion of a devastated post-World War II Japan by depicting tales of personal heroism that proposed models for social recovery.
Well, that was my hypothesis in the book that I wrote. Yeah.
I can see that. I'm no historian of World War II or post-war Japan, but that would make sense to me, everything you said in that excerpt that I read that you wrote as well. I think he breaks a lot of rules in making Rashomon too. Kurosawa, from what I read, he defied the 180-degree rule, which confused spatial relationships. So for listeners who don't know what that rule is, the 180-degree rule is a basic guideline in film that states that two characters or other elements in the same scene should always have the same left and right relationship to each other. And if the camera passes over the imaginary axis that connects the two subjects, it's called crossing the line. And he does this a few times in the movie.
He does. There are some triangular compositions where he's cutting among the characters. And by the way, these triangular compositions are a clear influence on Sergio Leone. You know, if you think about that final gunfight in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly.
Yeah, you're right.
And then you look at the staging of some of these confrontations in the forest in Rashomon. You see where Leone got some of his compositional templates.
Yet another great example of an influence this movie had. And also, he shot the camera directly into the sun. And from what I understand, I guess that's one of the first known examples of this in cinema, right?
As in Hollywood cinema, shooting into the sun, it creates lens flares. And that was considered to be a flaw, a sign of unprofessional filmmaking.
Okay.
Kurosawa was working for the first time with the cinematographer Kazuo Miyagawa, who was one of Japan's leading cinematographers. Kurosawa had always wanted to work with him, but they were just at different studios. But now, for the first time, they were able to work together. And I think part of the extraordinary visual impact of Rashomon comes from Miyagawa's inventiveness, right? In a lot of the forest scenes, for example, he's using mirrors to catch the sunlight and reflect it back up into the faces of the characters, basically creating some sort of high-key light effects on their faces. And the next time that they worked together was not until 1960-61 in Yojimbo. And that's another movie that has a very, very striking visual design. So Kurosawa didn't often get to work with Miyagawa, but these couple of times when they did come together, the results were really extraordinary.
Absolutely. Yeah, this whole question about how the film would have motivated or influenced or inspired other movies or filmmakers that came afterward. When you think of, there's just so many examples. You think of The Usual Suspects or JFK, Courage Under Fire, the movie Hero, Reversal of Fortune, Gone Girl, Wonderland, Blow Up, The Exorcism of Emily Rose, and even that Hollywood remake of this movie, The Outrage. Now, I never saw that. Did you see The Outrage?
Yeah, I've never seen that either. The director Martin Ritt is a fine filmmaker, but I just never saw the point of watching the remake.
How do you top the original, right?
Exactly.
So let's get into a little bit of philosophical reasoning here. What is the moral of the story to Rashomon? What messages or themes are explored in this film?
One of the main themes deals with how people respond to a time of crisis. The backstory in the movie is that this is taking place in a period of social collapse. The ruined gate, which is the gate to the outskirts of Kyoto, in the story, it talks about this collapse. It's a time of pestilence, it's a time of fires, it's a time of rampant crime. People are starving, there's a lot of theft going on. All of these things are analogies of contemporary Japan in the immediate post-war period. All this stuff was going on then. So he's giving us a snapshot in the past of realities that his movie audience would have experienced in one form or another. And in the context of this social collapse, Kurosawa is looking at a variety of human responses, most of which are venal and self-interested. But then he also has characters like the Buddhist priest and the woodcutter who aim to exemplify a more humane response to conditions of crisis. And I think Rashomon is an unusual film in that Kurosawa doesn't really give us a hero in the way that he had in previous movies like No Regrets for Our Youth and Drunken Angel and Stray Dog. It's more of an ensemble piece where we see a variety of responses to crisis.
Right.
And the film invites us to kind of pick our moral way through this morass of confusing and depraved human behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a kind of brave thing for him to be doing for an audience. And by not telling them what they should think, he's offering a kind of challenge that he is hoping that his contemporary Japanese audience will undertake and assimilate and reflect upon. Namely, how ought I to behave in these present confusing circumstances?
Mm-hmm.
What are the moral guideposts that I should follow?
Yeah, and like you asked, what is the nature of reality? What is the relativity of truth? That gets to the heart of this, doesn't it?
That's the dark part of the movie that Kurosawa has intuited, which is that to the extent that reality is socially constructed,
Mm-hmm.
then people may be prone to behave in ways that are entirely self-interested.
It's a pretty dark thought, absolutely. And in fact, he said that the truth of what really happened in the woods, Kurosawa said this, is it isn't the point of the story necessarily. And if that's the case, then maybe the lesson here is that truth can be interpreted differently by different people. And like you said earlier, the truth is subjective. Maybe there is no truth, only a subjective assessment of events. And he summed up the essence of the story as such, Kurosawa did. Human beings are unable to be honest with themselves about themselves. They cannot talk about themselves without embellishing. This script portrays such human beings, the kind who cannot survive without lies to make them feel they are better people than they really are, unquote.
Yes, and at the same time, they were filming near a temple,
Mhm.
and the abbot of the temple, when they were done with their production, gave Kurosawa a folding fan on which was inscribed, "Benefit all mankind." And this meant a lot to Kurosawa, and I think that it's an idea that he's tried to exemplify in his filmmaking. So, yes, Rashomon gives us a dark portrait
Mhm.
of the world, and yet Kurosawa seemed to feel that there would be beneficial value in offering that kind of portrait,
Hmm.
that perhaps its existential lesson for the audience would in the end prove to be positive.
Right. There's so many great lines of dialogue in this movie as well, especially by the commoner. Like he says at one point, in the end, you cannot understand the things that men do. He says, men just want to forget the bad stuff and believe in the made up good stuff. It's easier that way. And that makes me think that a lot of this film is concerned with the unreliability and partiality of experience and memory. The characters, like the audience, they often can't trust what they've seen or heard in this movie. And it reminds us that the human heart and the mind is complex and can be impossible to understand. And it also reminds us that human beings are capable of extreme behavior. You were touching on that earlier.
For good as well as for ill,
Mm-hmm.
which we see in the movie. And we leave the film with an act of charity by the woodcutter.
Can that be interpreted as kind of like a ray of hope for the future of Japan? I mean, that was a theory that was bolstered by the use of traditional Japanese music at the film's conclusion after Western influenced music is heard throughout most of the movie.
Yeah, I have to say, I don't think the selections from Ravel's Bolero work especially well. Kurosawa's composer, Fumio Hayasaka, was a very close friend of his. Kurosawa, he often imposed himself upon the scores of his movies, and he had asked Hayasaka to write something that was kind of like the Bolero. And yeah, I think it doesn't entirely work well in the movie. Well, perhaps the end of the film is meant to evoke a ray of hope. I think it clearly is offered as a counterweight to much of what we've seen before that point. It's as if Kurosawa is wrestling within himself about these forces of light and dark that he's been exploring in the film and visualizing through the symbolism of the forest. And at this point in 1950, 1951, right, the economy has started to come back, but the Allied occupation is still there. The Allies have not left, so Japan is not on its own yet. And there are all kinds of questions about what the future holds.
Sure.
So looked at that way, as a film made within a historical period of great uncertainty and a future that cannot yet be glimpsed, I think the ending of the movie has a degree of emotional truth to it. It's a filmmaker who wants to believe in the best and is honest enough to look at the darkness in the human heart and still hope for a better outcome. So that's the way I would read the ending.
I would agree. Also, I wanted to touch on the word Rashomon and what it means. So I read that it's Gate of the Dragon. Is that correct?
Rashomon is the name of the gate, and it refers to an outer gate typically an outer gate of a castle. This being the entrance to the outer districts of Kyoto.
Okay. But yeah, I mean, in terms of naming your film Rashomon, which connotes a gate of sorts, maybe that's fitting because as viewers, we are each gatekeepers of the truth. Does that make sense to you? Is this a fitting title to the movie?
Well, sure. I mean, gates are portals.
Mm-hmm.
They mark a zone and a boundary, and passage through a gate can carry all kinds of emblematic meanings. And so Kurosawa, he doesn't have the woodcutter pass through the gate into the Kyoto region. He has the woodcutter walking away from the gate, walking away from the rubble and the ruined nature of what you see there.
That's true. And also this gatehouse, it kind of stands as a visual symbol for a passage into the tale in a way. It's also interesting to me to see that the men are pulling pieces of the gate apart and using it for kindling.
Yeah.
And what does that suggest? Maybe that, I don't know, honesty and truth is crumbling and disposable in our modern world? Is that a reach to think that?
Possibly. Certainly the social order is consuming itself. And there's so much disorder that once noble treasures of architecture, such as this gate, have fallen into disrepair. And that certainly is emblematic of the nation and also of perhaps a lot of the imperial ideals that had led Japan into this abyss. It should be noted that Kurosawa was horrified by all of this, and he did not have to serve in the war, unlike a director like Masaki Kobayashi, who was drafted and then came back and made movies based on that experience. Kurosawa never went. He never had to fight, so he never had to face that uncertainty and that certainty of death. By 1940, 41, a lot of young Japanese were pretty sure that if they were drafted, that they would be killed. So he was able to stay at home and make movies. His career was not interrupted. And so it's interesting that in his films, he doesn't ever really inquire directly into the connection of Bushido with the imperial ideology of serving the emperor in the war. He never draws that connection in his movies.
Okay.
Kobayashi did quite frequently. And what Kurosawa dramatizes instead is the aftermath of the war, its effect on Japan afterward. And this is what he shows us in movies like Rashomon, even though he's using the past as a poetic device.
Interesting.
And he continues to do that really all through the 50s, and then he charts the economic recovery from the war in pictures like Yojimbo and High and Low.
It's just amazing. I mean, this would have been a career topper for a lot of directors in terms of quality and achievement, but he just keeps going and getting better, it seems to me, as his career unfolds from Rashomon on.
He's on fire at this point, that's for sure, on creative fire.
Absolutely.
At this point.
Right. So what elements from Rashomon do you think have aged well, and what are showing some wrinkles, perhaps?
In terms of elements that have aged well, I think that Kurosawa's camera movements have aged very well. And one has to think back to this period of time where the cameras are big and bulky, and you're going to lay tracks to get these movements through the forest. In movies today, cameras can be very lightweight and operated by hand, so it's very easy to move the camera, and you can also do it in the computer with a virtual camera if you're building your sequence that way.
Right.
And a consequence of that, I think, is that camera movement has gotten a little bit cheapened. It's a little bit easy to do, and therefore a lot of people do it for reasons that they really shouldn't be doing it. In Kurosawa's movies, the camera moves for a reason. I mean, when he moves that camera, it's pretty easy to figure out why and what the intended effect is meant to be. So I think those moving camera shots hold up extremely well. I think the cutting and the triangular compositions work extremely well. The cinematography is extraordinary and first rate. Toshiro Mifune's presence in the film is as powerful as it ever was. Personally, there are times where I wish Kurosawa had held him down just a little bit.
What do you mean? It restrained his performance?
Well, there's a little bit of scenery chewing in the film, I think. And as I've said, I think the use of the bolero music, the Ravel music, is distracting for a Western audience.
Okay. Yeah, for my part, although this is a period piece and culturally different from the expectations and values of modern Westerners, perhaps it's difficult in 2020 to see a lead woman character with so little agency and acting so subserviently. But how much power and autonomy did a woman in 11th century Japan actually have anyway? And in that period, what would have been the fate of a wife who was sexually assaulted?
Well, all of that's true, and it's also very true that in the Japan of 1950, 1951, when the film was made, there was not a great deal of sensitivity to issues of sexual violence. So Kurosawa is not going to exhibit that kind of sensibility. It's not part of his heritage. It's not part of the culture in that period, and he will exhibit some of that sensitivity in later films, such as Redbeard, where there's a depiction of child abuse in the film. But the limitations that we see in this respect in the movie are limitations that stand out to our 21st century eyes in a culture where these issues have gained tremendous salience.
Yeah, that's fair.
That's a big difference, yes, between then and the film and the eyes that we would bring to it now.
What's your opinion about the character of Masako as she's written here? Kurosawa has been criticized for kind of downplaying a lot of presence of female characters in his films. What's your opinion of Masako?
I think the character serves the narrative in the way that all of the characters in the film serve the narrative. I don't think that Rashomon is a movie that is as psychologically probing as, say, Drunken Angel or Stray Dog. I think these characters are emblematic characters.
Okay.
It's a film of metaphor and it's a film of symbol. It's a kind of allegory, if you will. And so the characters take on those qualities rather than the qualities that we might look for in a drama with strong psychological roots.
No, I could totally buy that. That makes sense. All right, so this is the 70th birthday year of Rashomon, and I contend that it's the fans who continue to get the gifts. So what is this movie's greatest gift to viewers, Stephen?
This movie's greatest gift to viewers is the respect that it shows to them. I think it's very important for movies not to fill in all the blanks. And I think it's very important for movies to retain mysteries, to not tell you everything, to provoke your questions. And that leads you back to the film. It leads you deeper into the film. And I think Kurosawa sustains an admirable degree of mystery in this movie. And it's something that John Ford did, the Hollywood director, whom Kurosawa greatly admired.
Is there a John Ford movie that stands out that is kind of a parallel?
Peter Bogdanovich asked John Ford, who had made a lot of silent movies, in an interview. He asked him, Mr. Ford, what do you think about dialogue now that you're making sound films? And Ford said, dialogue is fine as long as it's cryptic.
So they were kind of kindred spirits, Kurosawa and Ford.
Oh, yes. And they met and they admired each other. It's often thought maybe Kurosawa wore the dark glasses because that's what Ford did. And Rashomon is an admirably cryptic movie.
Absolutely.
That's its gift to viewers.
I like that. That's something I wouldn't have thought of, but it absolutely makes sense. Yeah, the cryptic nature, no question. For me, this is probably the greatest film featuring and about unreliable narrators ever made. When you consider how many filmmakers today use lead and secondary characters who prove untrustworthy and inconsistent to throw the viewer off track and keep you guessing, I think that's a testament to the power and immense reach of a movie like Rashomon. Not only do the four conflicting witnesses make for a compelling study in human behavior and an enthralling story, but they and the three men who take shelter in the rain, who are parsing this tale, they conjure immense questions about what we choose to believe as gospel and who and what we can trust. Real life is complex and often morally convoluted, and unlike so many other movies, Rashomon forces us to grapple with those complications, those faults, and those ethical predicaments. So to me, that's the film's greatest gift.
Oh, well said.
Do you think Rashomon has an audience in another 70 years? Who's going to be watching this movie 7 decades from now? That's a tough call. We're not going to be around, but what would you say?
Truly, I don't know. I've been writing a book about apocalypse movies, and we're in the middle of a pandemic, and the polar ice sheets are melting, and the Amazon rainforest is burning. So 70 years from now? I do not know.
It's a stretch, sure.
I would like to think so.
Yeah, assuming the planet is still intact and the human race is around, is this just going to be a curio on the museum shelf, or is this perhaps a movie that speaks to future generations?
I think it is a movie that will speak to future generations, and I think it's very important for us to keep old movies alive. Currently, with streaming and the internet, the ability to see older movies reliably is becoming more precarious. As we move away from hard media and the ownership model that was involved with hard media, it becomes more uncertain about being able to have access to older film.
This is true.
I would say, yes, Rashomon will speak to us very strongly, and it's important that we continue to have access to old movies so that young viewers can learn about cinema history and directors like Kurosawa.
What's your favorite Kurosawa film, if I can ask? Can you pick one?
Well, for a very long time, it was Redbeard. That was a very special film for me, yes. And now I think it's kind of rotating favorite. I love Stray Dog. I love Seven Samurai, Ikiru, of course. So it's hard. Francis Coppola said this is the tough thing about Kurosawa is that with most directors, they made maybe one or two excellent movies, but Kurosawa made so many excellent movies.
Right.
It's hard to choose.
It's amazing. He's easily been elevated to my second favorite director right after Hitchcock, but just by virtue of the sheer number of masterpieces this man has made.
I'm teaching a course on Kurosawa and Hitchcock this coming semester.
Are there any similarities or commonalities? What have you found?
Well, I think the commonality is that both of them have such a strong visual sensibility. When you understand what their signature is, then there's never any question whose movie you're in.
I'll have to give Kurosawa a whole nother look when I rewatch his movies now and think, I wonder if there's some crossover between him and Hitchcock. And as you said, maybe there is. So, Stephen, what are you currently working on that listeners should check out?
Well, I'm just now finishing up a book on apocalypse movies about the end of the world. And it's about how filmmakers have told us the world will come to an end. And it's organized in terms of the events that bring about the end. Sometimes it's alien invasion. Sometimes it's collisions with giant asteroids or meteors. Sometimes it's nuclear war. Sometimes it's a disease pandemic.
Interesting. Do you have a title yet?
Yes, it's called Apocalypse Cinema.
Okay.
I was writing the chapter on global warming and disease when the coronavirus pandemic broke out.
Wow.
So I'll tell you, that was a little bit strange.
And I'm sure we're going to get a wave of horror movies or thrillers that have something to do with the pandemic in the months to come. That's my guess.
Possibly so. When this started, Contagion, which was a Steven Soderbergh movie from several years back, was viewed massively on streaming media.
That's right. I remember reading about that. I've still yet to see it, but I'm sure there's a whole host of movies that can kind of tap into those fears that people are having right now, including maybe some older Hollywood movies. Do you cover the gamut from the start of Hollywood history through modern times with this book?
Yeah, I start in the silent period. And actually, I start with the literature of Revelation, right, and the New Testament, and then as one of the sources, and then work my way up into cinema.
Wow.
In the silent era, and then into the modern period.
Sounds fascinating. And when can we expect that to publish?
It should be out, I think, sometime in 2021.
Okay.
With Rutgers University Press.
Awesome. We will keep an eye out for that. Anything else we should also have on our radar? I assume you're still teaching. You're getting ready to start your next semester.
Yeah, we're getting ready to start. Yeah, Kurosawa and Hitchcock are on the front burner.
And you've taught that class before, or is this the first time?
Yes and no. I have taught Hitchcock before, but I always paired Hitchcock with Chaplin. That's a very organic pairing.
Huh.
And when I've taught Kurosawa, I've always paired him with John Ford,
Sure.
which is also a very organic pairing.
Right.
So this is the first time I'm putting the two of them together.
That sounds amazing. Wow. I'd love to talk to you sometime in the future and hear your thoughts on how you taught that class and what different observations you came to. Well, I want to thank you again for appearing on Cineversary and taking the time to talk with us to such great length and insight on Rashomon. Thanks so much, Stephen.
My pleasure.
Gotta tell you, after so many years of listening to Stephen's comforting voice and erudite insights a la Criterion Collection commentaries, it's pretty cool to have a conversation with the guy. He has been and will continue to be my go-to resource for Akira Kurosawa acumen. Next up, it's standing ovations time. This is where I give a shout out to a movie, book, TV program, website, podcast, or other work that I think would be of interest to classic film lovers. So for August, I'm giving the thumbs up to Criterion for another one of their outstanding box sets. Now this time it's the newly announced Essential Fellini, which gathers 14 of Federico Fellini's best movies in one fantastic collection to celebrate the Italian filmmaker's 100th birthday. Titles in the set include I, Vitelloni, La Strada, Knights of Cabiria, La Dolce Vita, 8.5, Juliet of the Spirits, Fellini's Satyricon, Roma, and Amarcord. 11 of the features even get new 4K restorations, plus the package is loaded to the gills with documentaries and archival interviews. You got audio commentaries, there's 2 extensively illustrated booklets boasting essays and images, everything you could possibly want in a Fellini box set. So if you're a fan of world cinema and one of the great masters of the medium, you are not going to want to pass up this early Christmas present, which streets on November 24th, a date that should coincide with the Barnes & Noble annual 50% off Criterion sale that happens every November. So start saving up those shillings right now. Instead of cluttering up our podcast with advertisements, we've decided to ask our listeners for their support. We could use your help to offset the costs to produce Cineversary, which includes expenses like podcast hosting provider fees. If you'd like to make a monetary contribution to the Cineversary podcast in any amount, large or small, we've made it safe and simple by partnering with PayPal to collect the funds. Simply visit tinyurl.com, that's tinyurl.com/donate Cineversary, and click on the Donate button. Any major credit card is accepted, and the entire transaction is handled securely and confidentially by PayPal. Or if you're familiar with PayPal, you can simply send us a payment in any amount you want to cineversegroup@gmail.com, and that's spelled CINEVERSE group@gmail.com. We really appreciate your generosity. Also, I'd love to hear what you think of our Cineversary podcast. You can email me suggestions or comments at cineversegroup@gmail.com. And I encourage you to visit cineversegroup.com, the portal for my film discussion group that I launched in 2005, where you can hear podcast recordings of our group discussions and read more about the movies we study. Parting is such sweet sorrow, but alas, we have to say sayonara to another outing of Cineversary. They go fast, don't they? Eager to find out what we have up our sleeve for September? We are going to enter the world of The Wise Guy and light 30 candles to commemorate the 30th anniversary of a mob movie magnum opus, Goodfellas, directed by Martin Scorsese and originally released in September 1990. This has been your humble host, Eric Martin, reminding you to butter up that popcorn, live a big screen surround sound life, stay safe and healthy throughout this pandemic, folks, and cherish those classic movies because they're not getting older, they're getting better. Thanks again for giving us a listen.